Good evening, all, and welcome. Tonight we are venturing into the great outdoors, and to show those with an affinity for the outside world that there are very dark and dangerous aspects to it. So get comfortable, grab your flashlight, and let the darkness take control. My father and I are avid campers. Not professionals, but my dad used to be a wilderness guide for kids. We typically prefer the eastern western Sierras, as they have great car camping spots next to lakes and a lot of great trails. Last summer, we decided to go up for a 2-night stay and do some day hiking. The campground was pretty full. Not unusual for the summer, but we were lucky enough to find a pretty secluded site where we set up our tents. The first night was normal, little bear activity, but we're used to that. The second night, I crawl into my backpacking tent and I pass out cold until about 3 a.m. when I wake up to the sounds of footsteps. My dad is a diabetic and needs to get up to pee around 3 to 4 times a night, and the sounds are definitely footprints, but they're coming from the wrong direction. We were located next to the bathrooms, so the footsteps should be moving in that direction, but they're coming closer to my tent. They stop about a yard short, and the breathing gets really heavy. I first brush it off as my dad, maybe lost without a flashlight. The breathing goes away, and I fall back asleep, only to be awoken a few minutes later to breathing right above my tent. You know that terror? The rush that goes up your spine. I had that. This wasn't my dad. I lay perfectly still, but the footprints continued to circle the tent. I had the rain fly on, so I couldn't see through the roof, and it was a new moon and pitch black. Now I convince myself that as a heavy sleeper, I am just dreaming. Just as that thought runs through my head, I feel a single finger run the length of my foot through the tent. Really slow and methodical. Now I figure I have to be dreaming, because my foot is in my sleeping bag and couldn't possibly feel that. But the comfort disappeared quickly when I realized, using the small ambient light available, that my foot was bare and out of the bag. I lay frozen as whatever it was stroked my foot for a minute or two, gave a few more labored breaths, and then just stood above my tent for what felt like an eternity before disappearing. I stayed up all night. In the morning, I heard my dad get out of his tent. I bolted up and met him by the fire. He looked me in the eye and asked if I had gotten up the night before. I asked him the same, and he said he had around 2 a.m. because he thought someone was going through our stuff. As I told him my story, we noticed our gear had been rearranged on the table. Every item, nothing taken. Footprints in a perfect circle around my tent. We still can't even talk about it without getting seriously skeeved out. I am originally from a major city in southern Ohio, and outside of town, there are a number of smaller townships. One of these is known as the more country bumpkin or redneck part of town. It's not even in the same county, but is part of the general area my city is thought of as. In the woods, there is this legend of Hell's Church, an old church that burnt down, where Satanists do rituals now, or a Satanist church that burned down by a ritual, depending on who you ask. There are a number of Hell's Churches myths in Ohio, in many different places, but this one was closest to us, and a number of my guy friends decided they wanted to be ghost hunters and check out haunted places around where we lived. We were all juniors in high school, and while all of us obviously thought this was just stupid bullshit, we thought it was funny to go out and scare ourselves. Plus, most people had cars or driving licenses by now, so we were enjoying this new burst of freedom. I'm a scaredy cat about most stuff like this, but I was the most tomboyish girl in the group, and always kind of wanted to be able to hang out with the guys. Plus, some of the girls in the group, who I was closer to, were going, so I didn't want to look like a loser nor a pussy. So one day in November, we decide we are going to go out one night and try to find this church. We had actually been to this location once before that fall, but one of my friends had a curfew. So after exploring an old barn and the railroad tracks on a nearby bridge, we left. We hadn't found the church, supposedly just a chimney at this point, to our disappointment and my mild relief. We took 2 cars out there, going past more populous parts of our city and back to this woodsy area. I can't honestly tell you how we got there, but I know it's off a state highway, then an abandoned access road past some old warehouse, and then down a dirt road. Once you get down the dirt road, there's a kind of thicker part of the road early on where we parked cars off the shoulder. We did this because the road thins out and becomes impossible to drive down, and also someone clearly owns this land, and later down the road there is some no trespassing signage. I'm sure tons of kids come back here, so it didn't seem odd to me that they wanted to block this place off. I barely thought twice about it. We get out of our cars and start walking to the dirt road, wandering off the path from time to time to check out barns or clearings where we thought the chimney might be. At first, it was just scary because it was dark and old or whatever. But then the barns started to get weirder. Like, they were filled with weird spray painting symbols and bullshit. But that's not what bothered us. We figured whoever was there before us did it, which I still 100% believe. But also other stuff, like dead owls that looked like they had been opened up, though they were dried out and decomposed by the time we got there, and other bits that looked like they may have come from animals. I was grossed out, but we all kind of agreed that these probably came from the teenagers that were trying to fake a satanic ritual, or the animals that got trapped in the falling apart barn and died there to be picked apart by other animals. My friends are now hardcore trying to find this stupid chimney, so they keep taking off through the trees into the clearing. Myself and the two other girls, who were there kind of hanging back on the tree line for most part of it, getting a bit more nervous and a little irritated each time we came up empty. As we kept going, we find a bike on the tree line. It's a bike that perhaps a 12-year-old would ride. That's a little creepy, but fine. Whatever. It probably belonged to someone who owned the land, and we decided that we were just going to go up a bit further, and soon enough, we find another bike. This one is older, a little rusted, but still undersized. We didn't talk too much about the other bike, just kind of mumbling that it's probably still nothing. One or two of the four guys, who were the kind who were trying to trump it, said these kids probably got murdered, or stuff like that. But no one is really having it. By this point, we've already been here for 2 hours, and it's getting very late. Plus, I think we're all a little more creeped out than we want to admit. We decide to head back to the cars, and I'm feeling relieved. Happy to be heading back to my house and getting the hell out of there. But things never work out that way, do they? By the cars, we see a road that goes straight up a hill through the trees. At the start of it, there's a big metal gate that has a road closed sign on it, which we had seen before, but for some reason had never occurred to us to try and go up the road. We had a small debate at the gate, about an evenish split on who wanted to venture up and who didn't. I absolutely didn't, but eventually we decide we'll go up just to see. Both the drivers wanted to go, so there's not a lot we can do about it. We climb over the gate and start up the hill, where an old pavement road is cracked and crumbled under our feet. Though it was for sure a real asphalt road at some point. In addition to the road condition and the brush being an obstacle, someone had felled a bunch of trees over the path, purposefully blocking off the road from any cars. Some of us started seriously questioning if we should be doing this, arguing that someone obviously wanted to keep us out of there, but we were getting teased for being afraid and kept going. I couldn't see where the road would end, because it was so dark. We had a few flashlights, but it wouldn't do us much good, and the tree made it hard to see. Plus the road was super steep, so all you could really see was up, with a little moonlight peeking through the trees. All of a sudden though, we reached the end. The trees just open, and we have come off the incline to a flat field. And holy shit, what a sight it was. It's the flat field with a tall prairie grass on either side, probably 2 to 3 feet high and pretty uniform. The path we are on splits the large clearing we are in down the center and leads through the grass to a cul-de-sac with 3 buildings. 2 look like they are farmhouses, with 1 barnish building. They were wood, and while they may have been painted at one point, they looked like they had mostly weathered and had been stripped by time. I see this and I am done. I want to leave. But of course, some of my friends say that we have to check out the buildings. At this point I finally put my foot down, as do the other 2 girls, and one of the 4 guy friends who decided it was enough for him. He was our valedictorian, so maybe he was just smarter. So the three guys who wanted to go to the building tell us to just wait there. And while we don't want to be in this field out in the open, we decide we can't just leave them. At this point, we've turned off our flashlights because the moonlight is so strong. The three of them take down this little path, and the four of us who remained stand together, bitching about how stupid our friends are and making small talk. None of us say it, but we are looking at the grass every now and then, worried something is going to jump out. It's just so creepy, this abandoned little settlement. It feels like our friends are gone forever. We see them get to a building and go inside. It was unlocked, I guess. We can see the flicker of their flashlights in the windows, and I just remember feeling so tense. It was like watching a horror movie in real life. After perhaps maybe 10 minutes, though it could have been just a tense 5, we see our guy friends coming towards us, lightly jogging, looking afraid for the first time of the night. "You idiots went inside?" I said, pissed off at them. One of my friends just looks at us, and I'll never forget it. It was full of bikes. Just bikes chained to the walls. We didn't believe them. We kept waiting for them to say that they were kidding. But they insisted. Said it was like they were just storing a bunch of bikes there. Most of them smaller. They looked afraid, and as much as I didn't want to believe them, I did. These aren't the type of guys that pull pranks on us for long. By then, we all agree that we need to leave, and we start down the hill, hurrying the best we can. All of a sudden, about halfway down the field, we can see a car's headlights down the hill, about where our cars are. We see them pass slowly, and we know someone is down there looking for us. Because it's so far off the beaten path, we figure it's one of two things. The cops. And we are going to be screwed for trespassing. 2. The people who own this land, or these houses or something, and they're going to either call the cops or murder us. We know the road isn't long, so they'll probably be turning around, circling back soon enough. And because our cars are there, they'll probably wait for us. We are all whispering about this as we pick up the pace, sprinting down the hill as fast as we can. I'm not a good runner, but I was hauling ass, getting down as fast as I could, basically hurdling over the fallen trees. Once we get down the hill, we don't see any headlights, but we know they can't be far off. One of our friends yells for us to jump in the cars, and we're fumbling with the doors like a horror flick, too nervous to get into them. We get in, and just as we start the cars up, we see the headlights speeding down the road, a giant black truck roaring up behind us. The truck seemed larger than life, raised up off the ground. The whole thing was terrifying, but extra terrifying was that we couldn't see who was driving in the dark, and with the headlights behind us. We peel out of there, totally pedal to the metal. The truck is still following, bearing down on us as our 2 cars race out of there. The car is also getting very close, threateningly close, almost as if it were trying to run us off the road. We're all screaming, looking back at the truck, fighting for some distance. Once we get to the highway, we're switching lanes trying to escape. Luckily, we were in sedans, so it was a lot easier for us to weave in and out of cars. But the truck is persistent and still chasing us. We are in two different lanes, but don't want to get too separated from our friends. Both passengers of both cars are texting back and forth, trying to make a plan. It took about 15 minutes to lose the truck. I'm not sure if the distance was too much or if they turned around, but once we got to a big shopping centre, we docked off the road and into a Sonic parking lot. We all sat in our cars for a little bit, watching to make sure we weren't going to be snuck up on, before getting out of our cars and getting some food and talking. Everyone, even the guys who had tried to act tough the whole time, were pretty shaken up. It took us a while to settle down, enough to head home. As much as we talked it over, we just couldn't figure out what happened. Eventually, we all did go home, during what was a pretty silent car ride. We didn't talk about it again for a long while, and we never called the police, which honestly, as an adult now, I feel like we should have. I don't think about it often, only during the fall really, but when I do think about it, I ask myself, who chased us? Why was that mini township abandoned? Who owned those bikes? And where are they now? Last summer, my boyfriend and I went camping in some nature preserve in Pennsylvania. I can't remember its name. It was pretty primitive camping. No cell service, and we saw 2 other people the entire time we were there. It was huge, so it was pretty empty. My boyfriend pretty much immediately said these 2 people seemed off to him right away. I don't know if they had anything to do with what happened that night, but I will describe them. The first person was a woman who had her truck parked off the trail, then the hood open. I don't really notice these type of things, but my boyfriend said it looked to him like she was waiting for someone to pull off besides her and offer to help with her trunk. Normally, my boyfriend is the type to at least offer to call someone, but he said she skeeved him out enough, so he didn't want to draw her attention more than necessary. The next person we drove by several times whilst we were setting up. He just kept driving by slowly and looking at us. I didn't even notice though, until my boyfriend had already pointed out that he'd done it twice before. Whether these 2 people had anything sinister going or not, the real story had to do with what woke us at around 3 a.m. It was incredibly loud and sudden. I couldn't describe it, or even compare it to anything, but my boyfriend said it sounded to him similar to a chain gun revving up, or someone using a large metal tool to scrape gravel. My boyfriend jumped up and looked out the little window of the tent. The sound happened again and again, and was getting noticeably closer each time. I was about to piss myself, but my boyfriend told me it was probably miles off. I didn't question this, because loud noises can be heard from miles off, right? Well, later, my boyfriend told me that's because he didn't want to scare me. It really sounded like it was coming from right down the little dirt road. At one point, he said he suspected it was right in front of our campsite. The only reason he didn't tell me to get out and dart for the car was because he was afraid It could be someone trying to scare us out the tent for some dreadful reason. He whispered. I should have noticed he was whispering and knew something was wrong, since otherwise he'd just speak normally, right? For me to go back to sleep. However, I couldn't, because every sound I heard made me think someone was sneaking up to the tent. Eventually, my boyfriend told me to get out and help him pack up. It was maybe 20 minutes after the sound stopped. He held our only weapon, a machete, in front of him. It was a full moon, or close to it, and we didn't need a light. While we were packing quickly, I noticed an empty beer can close to our dead campfire. It wasn't there when we were asleep around 10 p.m, and neither of us had bought any beer. Thankfully, we got out of there, and for the rest of the trip, we either camped in areas well populated by the campers, or got a hotel room. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and a ton of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, well, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there too long, without anything else going for you at least. Except a handful of doctors and lawyers and Georgia Power Company employees. The only employment in the area is at Walmart, fast food, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there is a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots at some of them glitter with bits of broken glass from what I'm guessing were car windows. Sometimes there are really shifty people hanging around these trailheads, or just driving around on the forest roads. They are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat-up $500 cars just barreling along roads meant for 4x4. Some of the people you see in the cars look like the guy that got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All that being said, it is still a great place to camp. However, you just have to be careful. So a few years ago, two of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the national forest. I know, it probably isn't legal. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip, so that we could play the next morning too. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. But unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all the spots in the area. This was really the only camping spot that we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late. We decide to keep on looking, so we drive for about an hour further and further into the woods. By this time, it's getting a bit dark, and we're getting a bit worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any service. We turn off onto an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the Forest Service rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. The broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That said, it looked like the 4x4 vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over the mound. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few miles down this road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed kind of odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running, and we set up the tent. As we began setting up the tent, I started to notice that there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the site. I see a green bottle laying on the ground. I take a look at the bottle, and I see it's a bottle of Home and Garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time, and just thought that someone had been dumping their home garbage out there. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in an area that is more than an hour from the nearest home. We set up our camp. We had some beers and made chili from scratch. It was delicious. By this time, it was probably around 11 p.m. As we're eating, we notice a faint glow from the other side of nearby hills. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles didn't make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was kind of like that glow you see over a bright city. We couldn't see the light source itself, though. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know I wouldn't have done so. However, we all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend Isaac decides to stay behind and pop some popcorn over the fire. We start walking towards the light source, and the situation gets even stranger. All the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of beavers that lived in the creek, but it seemed strange that a beaver would just go around all these trees and knock off the bark in a circle. Jacob and I are talking about the ghost beaver in pretty loud voices. This is probably due to our drunkenness, as we're almost at the top of the hill, and Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit." A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other and decided that maybe we didn't need to see what the light was after all. We walked back in silence, then kept looking back every few seconds. We decided to turn off our flashlight and just use the moonlight to get back to the campsite. When we get a couple of 100 feet from the campsite, I can see my other friend Isaac walking around the campsite. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wearing before. For some reason, he's carrying his paintball gun around his hand. That seemed a little odd, we said to each other. The fire had started to die down, so we couldn't see our campsite very well. At this point, we'd been gone for almost an hour, and from the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the site and was peering in the tent. When we were almost back at camp, we saw Isaac walk up the road we came in on. We figured that he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to return. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of a tent. He stumbles a few feet and vomits. After we left, he had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbles. We ask him why he kept wandering around the campsite with a paintball gun, and he gets a strange look on his face. They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it? We go and check the truck, enter the door code, and see that all our paintball equipment was just as we had left it. The keys to the truck were still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Isaac, what were you doing after we left? I ask. I was watching a movie on my phone. Then I fell asleep, I guess. But you were walking around with a paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets? Isaac said he had been in the tent since we left, and that he had been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us are way too drunk to drive, but we decide to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We don't bother packing up the tent. We just fold it down with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jump into the F-150 and I start to drive out. When we get to the dirt hump, we see something grey blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier is now back on its stand, right on top of the hump. By this point, all of us had sobered up to the situation, and no one wants to get out of the cart and try and move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I drive forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It falls right off. I assume it just must have been balanced there, and we drove over it, slowly. We were terrified that it would pop one of the truck's tires as we drove, but fortunately, it did not. As we drive down the road, we see a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it as the moon reflects light off it. I start to drive as fast as I can on the Forest Service Road, and the other vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer though. It just stays 1 or 2 turns behind us. We can only see it when the road straightens out. And after about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we make it back to the main paved road. I start to drive everyone back to my house, but I decide to go a different way just to be safe. I didn't get pulled over for a DUI, luckily. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place. I would never go down that road again though. I was hiking and camping in the Okefenokee Swamp. My girlfriend and I were far from being the only ones there. But when we woke up one morning, we took a canoe out in the swamp to explore. It was early, and there was a thick layer of fog resting just atop the water. The whole swamp was completely still. No animals in sight at all. We paddled down the waterway for a while and saw nothing else. Not a single person. Not a bird. Not anything. We did not hear a single sound. We had just cornered a bend in the swamp, and we hear it. The loudest guttural bellow I have ever heard in my life. I could feel it echo through my chest, a true dinosaur sound. We ceased our paddling to look up at each other, a little bit creeped out. We knew it was an alligator, but we had never heard one that loud. We both look behind the canoe, and behind us, the backs and eyes of at least 20 alligators had risen. They had just surfaced out of nowhere. We slowly start paddling forwards, and we hear more bellows. They came from all around us, in front, behind, to the sides. Sounds emanating from the bush-covered banks. Each glance behind us, we saw more eyes appear. More scaled mounds breaking the water's surface. From the banks in front, we could catch tails sliding in the water. Ripples of the huge reptiles broke the water all around us. We looked back again as we paddled faster. Easily 40 alligators behind us now, and we began to see them appear in front. 10 to 15 huge lizards seemingly blocking our path. Then, one of the largest alligators I had ever seen surfaces right where my paddle was going down. I hit the beast on the back of the head, and the thrash he made was incredible. When his massive head hit the side of the small canoe, I thought we were going to go into the water. Water came into the canoe as the side dipped down. The beast disappeared below the boat, and we held steady. We paddled forward as fast as we could, right into the dotted landscape of scales and eyes. Behind us, the same guttural roar echoed through my body. As we cut through the field of eyes and backs, we started to see a path clear. The huge monster that had almost capsized us bellowed one last time. We turned as we made it past the last of the animals, and we could see the monster staring at us, watching us leave. All the other alligators began to sink to the water's floor. The big guy stayed there watching, until he was satisfied we had gone. Then he disappeared without a sound, back into the black murky depths of the swamp. We banked the canoe further up, got out, and just sat around for a while talking about what had just happened. About 7 years ago, I was on a backpacking trip with 3 friends, one a ranger, and the rest of us biology and botany nerds. And all 4 of us saw something that we cannot still explain. Day 1 went off without a hitch. It was a bit long, and there was a lot of elevation gain. But nonetheless, we set up camp and heated up some nice beans and rice under what can only be described as the clearest summer skies I can recall. This is up in Washington State, and the night sky from the mountains are just unreal. The second day was different. All 4 of us awoke shortly before dusk to a shrill scream. Not super uncommon. Most of us are pretty seasoned hikers and campers and backpackers. The sound of something getting killed is pretty universal. None of us could quite make it out. If I remember correctly, we mostly assumed it was a coyote. Anyway, it was pretty close, which is probably why it woke us all up. So we started scoping out a small radius around the campsite. We found what looked like somebody had put a bomb inside an animal. No evidence of an actual explosive, however. I'm just trying to give you the same picture I had in my head. A totally indecipherable heap of flesh and fur, probably about the size of a German Shepherd, with similar fur coloration too. We discussed how odd it was for a bit, then decided more or less, what you gonna do, and moved on. Best explanation was something tore into it and bailed, maybe by the sound of us waking us up. On the 3rd day, we're winding down from a fairly short day of hiking. We were all tired, I suppose. I remember us joking about being old farts now and not being able to hustle like we would a few years prior. The sun was just making its way down over the tree line while we busted out the whiskey and started boiling a pot of water for more beans and rice. I'll never forget this. One of the crew was just launching into a story about his ex, and it went something like this. Yeah, so she was just about the worst possible kind of... And then he gets cut off by a loud pop, which we all unanimously recognized and described as a tree's last leg snapping before it falls. We're all standing now, scanning the tree line. We're in a small clearing, aside from the single large tree we're next to. A few minutes go by without a sound. Nothing. Then we start hearing the forest's life make noise again. We all settle back in, presuming the tree would lean up against another tree instead of hitting the forest floor. But it sounded pretty close, even though there weren't too many trees we needed to be concerned about. It couldn't reach us if it fell in the middle of the night. Then another wail, like the one we heard on the first night, except more distant. I never sensed it, but one of the crew said it sounded like it was coming from a cave, like it echoed. So we went looking for a cave in that general direction. We were out for about 45 minutes before one of us suggested we should head back, as we were going to be out of sunlight soon. Never did we find anything like a cave that could explain the reverberation. More importantly, it was starting to get dark, and we were a little a ways from the safety of our tents. Heading back towards the clearing and our campsite from the woods, something catches my friend's eye. "Did you see that?" He's pointing across the clearing about 9 o'clock. We're taking a direct path to our campsite, so it's dead ahead at 12. We're all looking in that direction, scanning the tree line. Where what? Dude, I'm telling you, there, right there, was a person just beyond camp. He's visibly shaken by it. It's pretty obvious he wasn't fooling around or thought he could be mistaken. And if you're wondering, shaken, because we're no way near a road or town, and even the nearest trail is miles away. A handful of times I've run into other backpackers in similar ways, people checking out your camp, heading the direction of your fire. So the rest of us are pretty open, let's go check it out. But not our buddy. He suggested we all take a knee and wait and hide in the tree line's cover. So there we are, kneeling in the brush, staring at our own campsite from the other side of the clearing, when we all unanimously see a figure start to move against the brush from 9 to 8 to 7, counterclockwise. Remember, we're at effectively 6 o'clock, so this becomes increasingly unsettling. I remembered noticing our ranger buddy readying his rifle, and another friend putting a hand on his knife. I'm pretty sure we're all feeling the same uneasiness now. I say we saw a figure, but really, we could just hear and occasionally see the brush moving in the area. My ranger buddy declares it's just a bear. The original spotter, whispering his argument, is standing like a person. We decide that either way, getting into the clearing and making our presence known is the best choice. We either need to scare off this bear or confront this person. So we all stand up and jog into the clearing shouting, "Hey, bear!" This is more or less standard procedure in case you're wondering. All being sure to keep our eyes towards the area we last heard and saw something moving. Nothing happens. Nothing at all. We're all just standing in the middle of the clearing, somewhere about halfway between 6 o'clock position and our camp, just waiting for something to happen. We're about 20 minutes away from total darkness, when there's another wail from 4 o'clock. Remember, we're all staring towards 7 o'clock? I whirl around before realizing one of us was already looking that way, and his face is totally pale. There's a bunch of adrenaline here, and everything is happening pretty fast, and I'll never forget catching the look on his face before I fully turned around. Then I saw it too. We all did. There's a silhouette of a tall man leaning over something else, facing away from us, and then he clearly rests on one knee before turning to look our way. Our ranger buddy has his rifle in the air. "Hey, who the hell is..." He's about to lay his aim for hunting, when the figure comes to full stand. It's hard to gauge, probably about 6 foot, and then absolutely takes off away from us. I don't mean like a man scrambling to run away, or a bear bounding off into the bush. I mean like Usain Bolt, as if he were born and raised in the mountains. Never in my life have I ever seen anything like it, and I'm almost embarrassed to admit it. My first reaction was ghost. After a pretty long wait, and arguing about what we have to do, we swing back to the camp to grab a few flashlights and our lamp. It's now past dawn and getting pretty dark. We make our way over to where the figure was leaning, and another mound of flesh. Without getting too detailed, this time some unmistakable fox paws were intermixed. Again, it looked like it was exploded open, and the meat eaten on the spot, not harvested like a hunter. You probably wouldn't be surprised to hear we didn't sleep much that night. We make jokes about encountering the Sasquatch out there. I've never been a spiritual man, and still am not, but it's very difficult to shake the inhuman, yet human supernatural nature of the way it looked and moved. Shadowy, and none of us could make out any kind of clothing that would break up its silhouette, since we could barely see any details anyway. We all figured an actual person's silhouette would be a bit more chopped by wearing a jacket, carrying something, a hat or whatever, and not to mention, I've never personally seen something kill quite like that. Closest thing I've seen is a deer carcass, post-bear, in a time of year that would have made it very hungry and aggressive, which wouldn't have been during our late summer hike. What gets me is we heard the same shrill wail 3 times, and the distance between our 2 sites and our day 3 site was close to 10 miles, meaning we were on the same general trail as it was, though none of us noticed any trail markings. Either that, or it was following us. A buddy and I were hiking the Appalachian Trail, only the North Carolina to South Carolina portion. It was summer, the weather was great, and we cross into South Carolina and meet a super nice elderly couple and talk with them and ate lunch. We made camp about half a mile from them after we part ways. So, we are about to fall asleep in our tent when we hear some rustling in the bush around the campsite. That's fairly common there, as there are a shit ton of squirrels and other animals around. The rustling didn't sound like a squirrel after a while, and it was actually multiple sounds coming from multiple places around us. My first thought, being a southerner who hunts, was that it was a pack of skidding coyotes. I was so wrong. We started hearing what sounded like low-level incantations, so after a few minutes, I'm fairly relieved that I don't have to fight coyotes. But then I remember that Carolina mountain folk can be some weird people. The chanting gets closer, and we can audibly hear what appears to be about 10 men clearly and repeatedly chanting, "Lord help us, Lord save us." It was similar to low-level and slow rhythmic monk chants. Well, that's creepy as shit, so I decide to let anyone near our tent know that we are armed inside. I take out the magazine because I don't want to inject a round, and pull the slide back and let go to clearly make the sound of a gun being racked. Obviously I put the magazine in and the chamber around after. That sound must have done the trick, because they walked past us. They were literally walking through our campsite to get to some type of gathering. We didn't sleep that night at all. It was the last night of our trip for us, so we kind of brushed it off to crazy weird capping off of the trip. 2 days later, we were hanging out with some friends, and on a TV in the background happened to be the local news. There was a story running about an elderly hiking couple found murdered on the Appalachian Trail about 2 miles from where we were camping. They showed their pictures, and sure enough it was the couple we met. They had been murdered and dismembered, and their body parts were found organized around a ritual site, like they were placed specifically according to some crazy demonic seance. We literally could have been swooped up by those men, and that could have happened to us. And all that time, I think about that poor couple and what happened to them. Carolina mountain people are really odd breeds sometimes. In the early 80s, when I was 8, my family was visiting my uncle, who lived in backwoods Missouri. He lived on a lot of land, and the only other people who really even lived on the street were relatives, so no one else ever just happened to be out there. This meant no one ever locked their doors, because random family members were always coming by for this and that. One night, while we were there, my parents and aunt and uncle decided to go to a nearby town to go bowling, because bowling. And my brothers, who were 11 and 12, and my female cousins of 6 and 14, and myself, also a female, stayed home. It was still daylight when the adults left, but it started raining pretty hard and got dark fairly quickly. We used to play this game that was essentially hide and seek in the dark, but we cleverly called it Vampire. There was a thin little mattress on the living room floor that some of the kids would sleep on at night. So the person who was on it would lie on the mattress and fold it over themselves like a coffin and count down to midnight. When they got to midnight, they went looking for you, with all the lights off in the house, and you had to try and make it back to the coffin before you were caught. Because the house was in the country, it was pitch black at night. You have to remember that we are very literally situated in the middle of the deep, deep woods, and you could not see your hand in front of your face. What this meant for the game is that 1. You couldn't tell where the vampire was looking, so you just had to make a break for it. And 2, if you were extremely lazy, and I'm sure by now you can guess which one of us met those standards, you could just hide in the living room with the coffin and get to base quickly. Ben, my 11-year-old brother, was it, and was doing the standard countdown. I was hiding maybe 6 feet from him. As he's counting, there's a flash of light. I don't know if I was already looking at the living room window, or if the lightning made me look. But with the backlight of the lightning, I see a man with his face against the window. He had his hands on each side of his face, as if he were trying to peer in, and looks exactly like the stereotypical creepster. Heavy set, scraggly beard. I could feel every hair on my body standing on end. Immediately, I began trying to convince myself that I didn't see what I saw. But then Ben sternly whispered, "If anyone is hiding in here, stay still." I sort of croaked out, "I'm here," right as there was another flash of lightning. The creepster was still there, but was no longer trying to look in the window. Instead, he was now looking towards the front door. Ben and I immediately knew what was coming next. From where he was standing, the creepster was probably only 5 feet from the front door. Ben was the same distance, but there was a couch between him and the door, and Ben leapt over the couch and locked the door right as the creepster was trying the handle. At this point, I guess Ben decided it was best to let the creeper know that people were home and that we knew he was there, because he flipped on the porch light and then started turning on the lights in the house. This is going to sound weird, but I was too terrified to panic. Having said that, I was relying completely on Ben to know and tell me what to do. He told me to go and lock the other doors, and was yelling for everyone to come out and lock all the windows. Honestly, the next few minutes are a haze in my mind. I remember everything up until this point extremely clearly. Then I remember the end very clearly, but I'm less clear about the middle. I know that I locked all the side doors and then the sliding glass door on the back of the house. When we've talked about it over the years, some people remember us seeing him out the back door as well. I don't think I remember that. What I clearly recall is locking the sliding glass door and standing there frozen, hearing Ben in a very calm but firm voice say, "Close the curtain. Listen to me, okay? Close the curtain." So I did. Ben can't even remember that part, and I just remember my fear in Ben's voice. We tried to call the police, but my aunt and uncle had a stupid party line, and it wouldn't work. Whether from the storm or from neighbours leaving it off the hook or whatever. For the record, they are the only people I've ever known with a party line, so this wasn't normal to me either. But for those of you who don't know what that is, in rural areas, multiple people on the same street would actually share a phone line. It would have different rings for different households, but you could pick up the phone and listen to your neighbour's conversation. We also tried to summon help on my uncle's CB radio, but it couldn't reach anyone. My uncle was a hunter, so he had a gun rack full of rifles in his room, but my older cousin was on an out-of-town hunting trip and took them with him. All we could find was a BB gun that looked like a real rifle. I vividly remember Ben trying to put me on phone duty and Scott, my older brother, on CB duty, while he stood watch at the little window at the front door with a BB gun. Maybe 30 minutes later, Ben said, "He's back! He's coming up the driveway," and the rest of us froze in fear. But Ben opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, pointed the gun and said, "Get out of here, right now." Then we hear our cousin Kyle, who lived down the road, say, "You know that's a BB gun, right?" Even though Kyle was only 15, I remember that we felt like we'd been saved when he showed up. Kyle seemed really skeptical of our story, like we were playing a trick on him, even though we had no idea that he was coming, but he stayed up with us until our parents arrived home. Honestly, I don't even remember if we even told our parents what happened when they got home. There was definitely no police involvement though. We just went on with our trip, but never played vampire again without some mention of that night. A few years ago, my friend Tez and I set out on the Great American Road Trip. We were going to drive from New York to Los Angeles, zigzagging through the country for 6 weeks. We were both in our early 20s, pretty broke, as my mom had been a long-haul trucker. I suggested that to save a ton of money, we should sleep in the back of our hatchback. It was a pretty cozy setup. We bought some blankets and sheets at Goodwill and cut one of them up to make curtains. By the end of our first week, we'd gotten so we could set up camp in about 10 minutes. Luggage moved to the front, curtains up, bedding laid down, and out for the night. We slept in parking lots, free campsites, rest areas, and basically anywhere that seemed safe and semi-legal. There were never a night, after the first night anyway, where we felt scared, until the last week of the trip in Arizona. We were near Flagstaff and had gotten pretty used to our routine. We didn't go on a set schedule and would never drive for more than 3 or 4 hours a day. No destination really in mind, outside a few must-see landmarks. We drive to places we found the night before on Google and take suggestions from other campers, locals, and people we met. We'd also gotten very good at making friends. We went to Denny's with a group of rednecks we met at a campsite in the back of their pickup because I got hungry and overheard them saying they were going there too. We met an 80-year-old cowboy who took us out drinking and taught us to line dance at a country bar. Played the guitar with some musicians in the middle of a thunderstorm and got fed breakfast and dinner by tons of campers who invited us to hang out with them. We spent the 4th of July with a family who basically adopted us into their campsite. Basically, every encounter we had with a stranger was a positive one. This night didn't look to be any different. We found a free campsite on Google and drove up into the woods following our GPS. We were pretty far out of town, and something seemed a little bit off when we pulled up into the campsite. There was one RV parked and 2 cars further up in the trees. We pulled up near the RV and a man opened the door. Tez waved hello and he just stared at her. His expression was completely blank. Then, as if she hadn't said anything, he just slowly closed the door again, staring at us the entire time. Figuring he just wanted some privacy and thought we'd be obnoxious, we pulled further down the road and found a flat spot to park the car. Instead of our usual routine of setting up camp immediately while it was still light out, we goofed around for a while, smoking and laughing and taking dumb photos of ourselves. Tez pointed out a campfire further down the campsite, and we decided to go be friendly. We'd met so many cool people in the previous 5 weeks just by going up and offering beers or just chatting, so we wandered over. Near the campfire there were 2 men, the owners of the cars we'd seen earlier. They seemed friendly, and we sat down to chat with them. They were drinking and smoking, and we sat down and had a beer with them. One of the men seemed pretty off, and we came to find out that the 2 of them didn't actually know one another. The older man was definitely on some sort of drugs. He was spinning in circles and talking about UFOs. However, he seemed harmless. This left us chatting with the younger man, who claimed to be a former park ranger. He was handsome and easygoing, and we spent several hours just chatting to him about our trip, families, everything. He then started talking about the bear. He'd seen a bear earlier in the forest. Tez didn't believe him, and he pulled out his camera to show her photos of the bear. It was very close to the campsite, and we both were a little freaked out. It wasn't unheard of for one of us to get up and go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, so the idea of a bear hanging around in the night spooked us. The ranger just laughed, and then his expression changed completely. It's hard to describe, but his voice seemed somehow cold. He said, "If you get out of your car in the middle of the night, it's not a bear you should be worried about." I kept waiting for the laugh, or for him to nudge Tez with his elbow, joke on the foreigner and the city girl, right? He never did. I laughed awkwardly and made a dumb joke about serial killers in the woods. My friend laughed, as well as joked about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We moved on to another subject, but within 5 minutes, the ranger had come back to it and was talking about something grabbing us from out of our car in the middle of the night. No matter how much we tried to steer the conversation away from serial killers, he kept latching back onto it. The older man was high as a kite at this point, and was staring at the stars, not talking. We'd just awkwardly laugh and sip our beers to try and get on the conversation, and see if it hopefully led elsewhere. Then the ranger stood up and walked towards the cooler to get another beer. At this point it's pitch black, and I can't see anything outside the circle of light from the campfire. The beer cooler was outside the circle. Suddenly, there is a red dot in the darkness, and it took a moment for me to realize that it's a camera. The ranger is holding a camera. He had taken a photo of us. I could see the screen on the digital camera light up. Now, it wasn't odd for people we met to ask to take pictures with us. My friend Tez is gorgeous, dark hair, blue eyes, like a young Megan Fox, and we were friendly people, and liked having pictures taken with others. It was an entirely strange thing to have this person take a photo of us without asking or even indicating that that was going to be what he was going to do. We were both staring at him like deer in headlights at this point. But instead of realizing what he's doing is a bit weird, he checks his camera, adjusts some things and takes another photo, this time with the flash. No asking for us to smile, no posing a group photo, and no explanation. After the photo, he comes back to the fire and sits down, and not a word is said about it. At this point, me and Tez are mutually freaked out. We make some bullshit excuse that we need to go set up our campsite and nope the hell out of there. When we stand to leave, the UFO guy smiles and says to have a good night. However, the ranger looks at us with a smile that doesn't reach his eyes and says, "Be careful out there. There are more than bears in the woods." Every hair on my body stood on end. I wasn't alone in my discomfort either, because Tez laughed a response out and pulled me away from the campfire towards our car. We rushed back to the car, which we only found in the dark by referencing the RV, and jumped in the front seats. My friend Tez is all but hyperventilating. "Why did he take a picture of us?" I was shaking. I responded. I read that serial killers sometimes warn their victims. She stared at me for a second and locked the car doors. "Do you think he just took victim photos of us?" We both freaked out. She was in a full panic and turns the headlights on in the car. I immediately yell at her to turn them off, because now he knows exactly where our car is. God knows why, but that is the only night we did not set up camp. We didn't need to tear anything down, so we just put the car in drive and floored it out of the campsite. As we got onto the dirt road, the ranger was walking towards our car with some cold expression. As you can obviously tell by the fact this story is being told, we found another place to crash for the night, and fortunately, weren't his next victims. I don't know if he is a serial killer or not, but regardless, he certainly knows how to creep a pair of girls out. My brother is 7 years older than me, so when I was around 9 or 10, he was in high school and had to hide from our parents that he smoked and dipped tobacco. As a result, most days of the week after he got home from school, as I was homeschooled, we'd go out into the woods for an hour or two. We lived way out in the country, in an already rural part of East Texas. So there were plenty of woods to explore. The land south of our house was all owned by a mining company, and my parents didn't want us going out there. So we always crossed a fence to the north of our house and explored the woods out there. Very likely, someone's local property that we had no business being on. But when you live out in the country, you figure you'll have plenty of sign before you accidentally walk into someone's backyard. After a few months of venturing out in this area, we never traveled more than an hour's distance from our house, and always in daylight. We decided one day we'd just keep walking and walking. My brother smoked and spat into a Dr. Pepper bottle. We entered big pastures and drove back into even deeper woods. Whenever we talked about it, we've always said that we must have traveled at least a mile, but we usually say far more. Eventually, we came across a circular pond. I distinctly remember having a much higher rim on one side, and my brother explained that was because a tractor had dug it out and piled up more dirt on one side than the other. We kept on going past the pond and entered another patch of wood, and we came out and saw that the tree line curved around sharply to the right, and the clearing we now stood in opened up far wider. We went in that direction, and while my memory of getting there is a little hazy, I know that we suddenly came across a very large white building surrounded by a high fence. There was a gate large enough for vehicles to move in and out, and a dirt road leading away from the facility. We could hear the sounds of activity and could see people walking around the outside of the fence near the gate. I'm afraid any other details I could give at this point might be coloured by false memory or exaggerations from an imaginative young brain. At that moment, we both felt the spine-tingling terror, alerting the body that something about this was very wrong, and that we were not supposed to be here. We were at least going to get in very serious trouble. We were standing in the middle of a clearing, gawking at a facility of some kind, on what was obviously someone else's property. We were seeing something deep out in the woods that we had never known was here. All this time we'd spent walking around these woods. If we had just gone a little ways further, we would have stumbled across this. I remember standing there for a moment longer, asking my brother what this could possibly be. He told me something along the lines of, "I have no clue, but we really should get out of there." The tone of his voice truly freaked me out, as I remember running back hard the way we came, crossing the same pond and cutting a path as close as possible to the route we had travelled. When we finally stopped, out of breath, my brother told me that there was no way, shape or form that we could utter a word of this to our parents. They were spankers, and awful grounders, and he knew the trouble he'd be in for taking his little brother into what was quite possibly danger. After that day, we kept going out in those woods, but never that far. Eventually, my brother got caught with a can of Skowal, and my dad made him eat the whole can and puke it up on the porch. Being an easily intimidated little kid, it wasn't hard to get more information out of me than my brother's smoking and dipping habits. But I never brought up the facility we found. Over the years, my brother and I had brought it up many times. Our parents had gotten way laxer since we'd all grown up, and we even told them the story, to my mother's retroactive shock. We've added a lot of other weird ones to our arsenal in the time, as our family has always lived by huge areas of land for us to wander around. But this one would always be our favourite. It's always, remember the time we almost got killed by those government researchers? Remember the time we found that crazy building in the woods with people walking around it? But for the past few days, this event has been really bugging me. I had told my wife about it in detail, and she was pretty amused. I thought I'd look around in Google Maps a bit. Something I'm honestly surprised I'd never done before. And what I found, or haven't found, is really bizarre. Moving north from my old house, which has since burnt down and left an ugly scar on the satellite image, I can clearly make out the woods we spent our time in. When I go further north, I see several large clearings, followed by more wooded area. Eventually, I even found the circular pond, and I'm positive I can make out the higher end of the pond that we stood on as my brother explained how it had been made. When I drag the map further up, I see what looks to be the clearing and the sharp curve of the tree line to where we saw this facility. But there's nothing there. No trace of a building, no evidence of a dirt road leading away from an old structure. It's just pastures and more trees. In fact, when I zoom out and look at the whole area, it doesn't seem possible for there to have been an operation of that scale that we saw. Just a little ways further north, the land becomes nothing more but a pasture, with houses pressed up against a country road. For people to have come and gone from this area, they would have had to have made roads of some kind, as well as power lines stretching out to the building. But there's nothing like that on Google. In fact, there really is no, here it was, spot on the map. It's like it was never there to begin with. It's been a few years since I've talked about it, so I texted my brother earlier today, asking him if he still remembered what happened. He called me immediately after and said, "Hell yeah, that was a really weird day. You know how good I used to be in those woods, but that shit really freaked me out, and we had to get out of there." The whole event feels more like something that we walked into that we shouldn't have seen. I still remember the feeling of dread upon finding the place, and knowing that something bad would happen if we stuck around. I've decided I'm going to message my brother and see if maybe he's up for one last walk in the woods to see if we can get to the bottom of this once and for all. You see some interesting things working nights as a janitor, such as a life-size doll under the bank president's desk. You learn some hilarious quirks, like an official wanting the vacuum marks perfectly parallel on his carpet, because he gets upset otherwise. Sometimes you see things you can't quite explain, like the reflection of a dog in a mirror that is never there when you turn around, but shows up night after night. Some things are quite chilling, like when the building music would switch on by itself as I turned the lights out. Of course, Being in empty buildings alone at night made everything take on an extra dimension of spookiness. One of the only things that truly scared me, however, because it was more tangible than the mirror dog ever could be, and potentially more dangerous than Glitchy Muzak. It was a miserable night, with blizzard conditions that are not uncommon in winter here. The wind was howling, snow was blowing, and it was dangerously cold. Altogether, the kind of night you don't want to be out in. My last building for the night was in the outskirts of town, in the real middle of nowhere. There were no nearby houses, and nothing in that area was open at night. In short, there was no reason for anyone to be out there, especially in that weather. The building was not a spooky one, just isolated. I made an absolute habit of always locking the doors of the building that I was working in, because even in a safe town, a female janitor alone at night seems like too easy a target. That night was no different. I know I locked that door, and if I hadn't closed it firmly, the strong wind would have. I went about my usual routine, turning all the lights on all 3 floors, and then setting up my supplies. The building had an odd layout, with a sort of bird's nest loft that the boss's office was in, overlooking the main floor. I usually started with a loft and headed up there, but realized I had forgotten something and headed back down. I was distracted, and this building always annoyed me, but I wasn't listening to music and didn't even have earbuds in, so I was very reasonably alert. So I was a little surprised to find the side door standing wide open, with the wind rushing in and snow already drifting up. I froze a bit, because there was no reason that door should be open. I checked the parking lot quickly, in case the building owner had for some reason showed up in the middle of the night. No cars but mine. After locking the door, I shut the building. I started searching the building, starting with the basement. I didn't see anyone, and nothing was disturbed. As my search reached the loft level, the reflection of the basement lights in the stairwell went out. Then the lights on the main floor went out, and I heard the door bang open and rattle in the wind. So I shut myself in the office for a while. Eventually, I admitted that I had to finish the building, or I would probably get fired. So I locked that door for the 3rd time that night, turned all the lights back on, and cleaned faster than I ever had before. I should have called the police, but luckily, nothing happened that night, or on any other nights since. This happened a few months ago. I am a female, and at the time, I was 18. Now, I live with my mother, stepfather, and younger brother in a 3-bedroom apartment on the bottom floor. It is a nice place with 2 balconies, which are about 8 feet off the ground, because the building is built on a rather steep hill in an isolated area. Now, the front door of the apartment is self-closing, and when it closes by itself, it slams rather loudly. Now, my family had decided to leave and go for some Indian tacos, and since I was home, they didn't bother to lock the door. I decided to stay home because I am an introverted extrovert and had already been social enough that day, and I wanted some me time. My family is located in a town in Nebraska that doesn't really have much crime. It is nothing like the part of the town that we originated from. It is a town full of military families that have plenty of money. Pretty much the only thing to worry about are the little city brats who've been spoilt so much They think they can get away with anything. Anyway, the apartment setup is quite simple. You have the front door with a little hallway, which, if you go right, you then have the living room, kitchen and dining room. Then if you go left, there is another hallway which has 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. Now my room is the very first one in the hall. One cannot pass my room without me knowing. This was an intentional choice when we moved here, due to my anxiety and PTSD. I have problems with paranoia because of past experiences. My little brother was intentionally put between my bedroom and my parents at the end of the hall because of said paranoia. Mainly, my need to check on my family members after I've had one of my terrible nightmares. Now, I had laid back on my futon in my room, and I had my bedroom door closed so that I could enjoy my privacy without my anxiety kicking in and making me think someone in the apartment was with me. I was listening to true horror stories through my headphones and reading Naruto fanfiction on my phone when I heard the front door open and close. I glanced at the clock, and it read 7:36 p.m. I thought, okay, they're back, and my little brother will follow the same routine and burst into my room without knocking to bug me and let me know that they were home. I waited. Nothing. No yell from my mum that they were home. No jingling of keys. No door opening. Nothing. I took off my headphones and listened. I could hear someone walking on the carpet. The familiar swish noise of footsteps travelled around the whole apartment. I waited, my anxiety rising up in my throat before the calm came. Now the problem that I have with my anxiety and other issues is that everything happens as a delayed reaction. During a crisis, I am able to act completely calm and in control. But after I am in a safe place, I break down completely. I sat on my futon opening my mouth, slightly, to quiet my breathing. Smooth, slow breaths through my nose and mouth at the same time. My heart was still pounding. I looked at the door to my room, waiting, thinking that it must just be me hearing things again. Thin apartment walls and such. I then heard the person walk down the hall and try to open my parents' bedroom. I stared at my door even harder. I heard them turn and walk back down the hall, stopping halfway. Shit. They must have seen the light under my door, I thought. I watched the door, not wanting to move from my futon, and have the metal futon stand make a loud creaking noise. They came to my door, and I heard them touch it. The instant I saw the door move slightly, from them putting weight on it, I jumped up and ran to the door. Now the entryway to my room has the door inside a little square area, so I ran over and put my back against the wall and put both feet on the door. I grabbed a nearby blanket and put it at the bottom of the door. I watched the door handle, and it never moved. They never even touched it. The person on the other side just kept pushing on my closed door and latched door. No lock, just me holding it closed. I felt the door push against the weight of my legs and feet. I knew I wasn't imagining this shit. I could actually feel the door move. I still had my phone in my hand. I quickly turned to call the volume all the way up and dialed 911. A man answered and I gave him my address. The volume so loud you could hear the conversation, as if the phone was on speaker, and I explained the situation to the dispatcher, and we talked for a bit. He asked me if I had something to defend myself, and I told him I had pepper spray in my purse, but that it was 8 feet away from my bedroom door, and laughingly said that it's probably not a good idea right now. The dispatcher agreed with me. Now, during all of this, the person on the other side of my door had been listening, and it seemed as if they finally understood that I had called 911, because I heard them run through my apartment, over to one of the balcony doors, rip it open and run out. I informed the operator of this, and we continued talking until the cops arrived and they checked. Nothing was taken, and nothing was moved as far as I could tell. My family arrived to the cops being there and were freaking out. My mother nearly went mama bear, she was so freaked. So that's the story. Why you should always lock your doors, even if you're at home. I had a business trip that took me to Arizona and didn't want to pass up a chance to visit some great views and hiking in Sedona. So worked it into a long weekend. I got up early one morning to hit the trail before the pink jeeps descended upon some of the more visited places. First stop was a previous Anasazi site, purely for historical reasons. After hiking in from the road by foot, I got a good 30 minutes at the site before the first jeep tour showed up, packed up my day, and headed down the trail. My second goal that morning was a fairly gradual but scenic hike up the side of a nearby mesa. However, the weather that day wasn't cooperating, and I kept my eye on some thunderstorms to the south that were building. As I continued to gain altitude on the switchback trail, I had a beautiful view over the valley towards Cathedral Rock. The low clouds filled in and began to build, and some downpours were visible, but no strikes landing on the mesas in the rain and lightning. I picked up my pace and made the lip of the mesa, walking slowly to a smooth rocky outcropping with great views and to catch my breath. I wasn't sure what caused me to it, but I took off my hat, turned around and looked up. I saw low scud clouds with wispy tendrils slowly swirling in a circle overhead. The outer fringe was dark grey, the central core a lighter shade, and suddenly before my eyes I saw a large wingspan bird appear from the center of the swirl, all dark, not the coloration of an eagle, and with the wing feathers separated like a turkey or vulture, but even larger. I watched the bird as it drifted, sometimes with, mostly again, the direction of rotation of the cloud swirl, and I don't recall seeing it flap. I took a quick moment to look south at the advancing storm and saw my first lightning strike well off in the distance. I looked up at the bird again. It made a right-hand turn for the center of the swirl and then vanished as it cruised across the center of the swirl once more. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, processing what I'd seen, waiting for it to reappear, but nothing. Truly a mesmerizing natural encounter. I grabbed my pack and made tracks down the trail to make it to the vehicle before the storm that was approaching fast. Being alone on the trip, I really had no one to discuss it with, and mulled over the experience for the rest of the afternoon. I took a warm shower, dressed up, and then drove to an Italian restaurant, newly opened on the main drag in town. They didn't seat until 5 p.m, so I wandered into the German mineral shop next door to find some mementos to give to my friends when I got back home. The lady behind the counter wasn't friendly, not overly chatty, and looked the granola part that I would expect for such a place. Incense burned in the corner, and peaceful Native American flute music played over the speakers. She asked how my stay was in Sedona, and told her I was enjoying the views and the hiking. I told her where I'd gone hiking to see the Anasazi Cliff dwelling, and she walked to an old yellowed map on the wall and pointed to the site. "This one?" she asked, interested. I looked at her and said yes. She was pointing to the site I had visited. I looked next to where she pointed, about where the mesa was, and a very large red swirl was centered there. The map had several of those markings, mostly around the perimeter of the valley. I asked her what they marked, and she replied, "Oh, those show where the energy centers are that the Native Americans discovered before the white men came to the valley." I hadn't told her about my trip up the mesa, but she must have sensed it from my facial expression and asked, "Did you see something up there you can't explain?" I had to admit yes, and without inquiring she said, "Yeah, it's a pretty active place. I like to go up to the mesa and get rejuvenated there, particularly when the weather is acting up." For a cynic like me, that was a pretty unsettling and simultaneously awesome day. I have had guns held on me. I have been in car wrecks, got stuck out in the middle of the mountains with a dislocated knee in winter, and this is easily the most frightened I have ever been. Which is weird, because I didn't really have any real reason to be scared. It was in the deep woods, in Vermont, maybe at 11 at night. I'm in my hammock, just sorta chilling. I'm reading by my headlamp, when I hear a noise. I kill my lamp and listen. It sounds like something is moving about 100 yards away. I squeeze my eyes shut. I have pretty good night eyes, but I'd just been reading, so I couldn't see much. And I listened. I didn't hear anything else, but I was uneasy. I slid out of my hammock and snuck over. There's a large flat rock with 2 stumps on either side, like chairs. Laid out on the rock was dinner for one. Plate, flatware, a big-ass sandwich, and a dark brown bottle. I was confused and a little creeped out, but not unduly scared. I reached for the bottle, not to drink it, just curious, and when I picked it up, it was ice cold. This was the middle of summer. There was no way it had been sitting out there for more than 20 minutes. As soon as I realized that, I got that horrible ripple down my spine, and the feeling of eyes on the back of my neck. I put the bottle down real slow, and put my hand on my pistol, as I always carry a .45 in the woods. I looked around and didn't see anything, but I still felt like somebody was eyeballing me. I walked back to camp, and my head was spinning like a top. I was ready to piss myself. I made it back to camp, but the feeling inside me persisted. If anything, it was worse. It reminded me of all the times I had to go down into my grandpa's basement as a kid and walk past his old stuffed deer head. That feeling of terror, and the knowledge that if I ran, it was going to get me. It was just like that. I was scared out of my mind, but by the time I got back to camp, I was sure that if I ran, something was going to pounce out of the trees. I left all my shit and walked maybe another 20 yards through the trees to one of the mini craggy cliffs you get out there, white-knucking my pistol as those shivers rippled from the back to my neck. Every horror movie I'd ever read, every scary story I ever told, it was all bouncing around my head. I put my back to the rock, and I stayed there. I had that feeling of being watched by something that had no love for me until about 3 in the morning. When the sun came up, I packed my shit and booked it. I didn't go back to the table. I just got my gear and hoofed out of there as quickly as I could. I had to sleep another night in the woods before I was out. And while I didn't feel anything, I still hardly slept a wink. Now, I'm fairly certain there was some kind of explanation for the food, and I'm sure the feeling I got was that I was just scaring myself. That said, while I love to camp in the Green Mountain State, I haven't been within 50 miles of that spot again, and I still have nightmares about it. I went backpacking with my cousin about 4 miles into the Angeles National Forest. We set up camping during the day and went on with our normal backpacking routines. Come nightfall, we each go into our individual tents and call it a night. Around 3 a.m, I start hearing light scratching on my tent, as if rats were trying to get in. I smacked the side of the tent a few times to scare them away, but nothing. It just intensified. I couldn't pinpoint from which part of the tent the scratching was coming from, so I kept smacking. Nothing. At this point, I look over at my dog, and he's looking at me like, I ain't going out there. So I try to ignore it and go back to sleep, but I can't. It's freaking me out, and I don't want to leave my tent to investigate. So after a while, my cousin calls out to me, "Hey man, have you been hearing shit outside? Because I've been hearing footsteps around my tent." So now we're debating going out to check it out or not. We don't. Eventually the sounds went away, but we didn't fall asleep for the rest of the night. In the morning we checked our campsite, and there was nothing. No traces of anything. No tracks, no scratches on my tent, poop, nada. We promptly packed up and got the hell out of there. I will tell you the story my Uncle Joe told me at Christmas a few years ago. He had arrived in a leg cast, and we all wondered why. Well, he worked for the Water Resources of the United States, U.S. Geological Survey, outside of Billings, Montana. Uncle Joe is a tall, lean, athletic man that ran 5 miles a day during the week before going to work. He is an avid outdoorsman. One day, he was out in the mountains leaning over a creek to collect a water sample when he heard a loud huffing noise behind him. He turned and saw a grizzly bear running towards him. Joe knew better, but instinct took over and he jumped into an adrenaline-fueled sprint. He got 2 steps before the bear swatted his leg and hamstrung him. He collapsed to the ground and pretended to be dead. The bear stopped, sniffed a couple of times, then turned and ambled away. Joe didn't know why the bear had approached him, but his running away told the bear he was prey. Fortunately, the bear wasn't hungry that day. I went camping in Big Sur, California, with one of my best friends. It was off-season and a Sunday night, so the place was practically empty. We picked a campsite about a half-mile walk from the ocean. It was in a huge open field, surrounded by a lush forest. In the background were limestone mountains, and you could hear the crashing of the ocean's waves. Very epic. We spent the night around a campfire, telling stories and eating. We're both pretty experienced backpackers. We are very diligent in ensuring we do not leave any traces of food by our site, and almost everything other than our essentials go into the bear box. I have my dog with me too. She's leashed around one of the few trees in the field on a long metal leash and full harness. It's a full moon out, and it was pouring beautiful blue light across the field. It was absolutely pristine and breathtaking. At around 1 p.m, something spooks my dog. Now, she's used to the woods and has an incredibly calm demeanor. But I mean, she is flipping out, tugging hard on the leash, as if she's desperate to escape. And she does. She pulls so hard that her harness snaps, and she goes bolting across the field into the wilderness. I lose my cool. I drop everything and bolt after her. I am not thinking straight running into the woods at night. My only concern was getting her, even if it meant risking my own safety. I rescue her, and I find her curled in a random clearing in the woods, looking ashamed and terrified. Thank God she ran in a straight line. Otherwise, I would have been totally lost. I walk back carrying her, and my heart is pounding furiously at the horror of the idea of her being lost in the wilderness forever. The thought is now unbearable. I can feel her heart pounding too in my arms. She is legitimately terrified. I am no longer in a great mood. We all head to bed in my tent, but my dog won't lay down. She refuses. Her ears are up, and she's staring intensely at the tent wall, as if she could see through it and is tracking something. It takes a while for my nerves to calm down from after the chase. I'm working hard at taking deep breaths. I'm reminding myself that I'm prepared for anything that I could encounter. That my dog is simply spooked from maybe a raccoon. Maybe she's just exhausted and acting up. And that is when I hear it. The cackling. A high-pitched laughter that is full of disgusting types of joy coming from outside my tent. My senses go on high alert. My body tenses up so tightly. It's like I'm about to break in half, and I cannot even breathe. And then I hear more cackling, like a group of witches were doing something evil just yards away. It fills my hearing, laughing and laughing and more laughing. It's loud and just sounds so wrong. I can't even bring myself to move to look at my friend. It's like my entire body has given up. The laughs are then followed up with blood-curdling screams. It honestly sounded like someone was being murdered. It was full of panic and horror and sadness. Dear God. It could have been wolves or coyotes killing their prey, but it sounded so distinctly human. The laughter, the sobbing, the screams, Finally, my friend says, "What the hell?" I even begin to laugh a little, because the situation was so intense and wild. I had no idea how else to react. I couldn't handle this. I suggest that we bolt for the car. It's a mile away, so we decide to wait it out. We just listen to the laughter and screaming until it fades away, and even when it's over, I don't bother going out of bed. I was performing research on various tree bacteria in the woods when a shirtless, heavy-set man comes out of nowhere with a seriously dangerous-looking axe. He's sweating and smiling, as though he has just got done chopping. Mind you, we're in the middle of nowhere between two bordering states. It's uncommon to see anyone other than patrol. Like a bumbling idiot, I announce my feelings and inquire about his axe. His response? "Yeah, it's pretty sharp. No problem cutting through somebody if you're not careful." Immediately I noped out of there, walking at the brisk pace I could without running. Tried patting on my radio every now and then, hoping he'd think it was working. And it wasn't. I looked behind me every so often, and he just stood there the entire time. Some say he's still there to this very day. I worked on a hotshot crew at the time for the Forest Service, so we spent 2 to 3 weeks at a time out in remote areas. We covered a large amount of ground on foot, generally no way near trails or common backcountry traffic. We found plenty of strange things, like stashes of guns, creepy old trapping cabins, and even had to shoot a bear once that was way too interested in our spike camp. We took bear matters extremely seriously. After a crew member was attacked by a bear in 2008 while performing a burnout operation. Bears are no joke. They are seriously dangerous. Well, one day, my buddy Greg and his saw partner were following the fire, cutting line. Suddenly, Greg noticed a pair of Carhartts, half buried in the ground. "Ooh, Carhartts," Greg said with enthusiasm, plopping chew spit out. Greg's saw partner knew something must be up, as he noticed from a distance that Greg pulled out his chew and flicked it on the ground. Greg always saved his chew for a 2-use cycle of consumption, and his partner gave him that chew an hour ago. As Greg picked up the incredibly heavy pants, they still had legs and parts of the vertebrae inside them, the upper half of the body totally missing. Turns out, some poor guy got torn apart by a bear. Literally torn apart. They found the rest of his body a quarter of a mile away. Must have happened a few years ago, because the remains were all bones. The Carhartts were completely intact. We thought it would make a great Carhartt commercial. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's Tales in the Woods. If you did enjoy the video, please remember to drop that big thumbs up button, as well as leave a comment with your thoughts. And remember to hit the little bell icon and subscribe to be notified every time I post. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.